Good morning, America. Today I'm continuing my series focusing on U.S. involvement in World War II. I'm going to talk briefly about the Battle of the Atlantic. Alright, during World War II, Germany did their level best to try to isolate and cut off Great Britain from the Western Hemisphere. Great Britain during World War II is very isolated. Germany occupies all of continental Europe pretty much. Great Britain cannot make all the weapons and ammunition and so forth it needs to survive against Germany alone. Nor can Britain even grow enough food to feed itself either. So things have to be manufactured in the United States and Canada and transported over to Britain by sea. Germany does its level best to cut off that stream of supplies and then across the Atlantic with submarines. Of course, the submarine was not a new invention. The submarine was originally invented. It was actually really originally invented in the Civil War, though it didn't turn out very well for the guy who invented it. He died. But the submarine was first used in combat in World War I. But by World War II, they've gotten good enough that they're actually useful in combat. German for submarine is Unterseeboot, abbreviated as U-boat usually. So the Germans send out, especially once they take France, German U-boats operating from bases along the French coast venture out into the Atlantic in wolf packs to take out British shipping. And once America joins the war, then they start targeting American shipping too. And this has a very catastrophic effect on transatlantic commerce, especially in the early years of the war. Sure, in the early years after America joins the war, German U-boats show up on the east coast of the United States. The American east coast cities are still lit up at night like Christmas trees, so the German U-boats will target ships heading up and down the east coast of the United States at night. They're silhouetted against the lights along the coastline, and they take them out. Bam. The Americans have to learn the hard way that to protect their ships against the U-boats, they can't just send ships willy-nilly across the ocean. The ships have to go in convoys that are escorted by the United States, by naval forces. And so there's a running battle then between the naval forces trying to protect the convoys and the German submarines. The Americans, to counteract the submarine menace, the Americans and British, they invent something called sonar. Sonar is used to detect the presence of German submarines underwater, which gave the Allies a small advantage. However, the sonar of the day was very primitive, and the Germans find ways to evade it. The Germans did their level best to cut off the stream of supplies across the ocean. They sank an awful lot of ships, but they could never fully cut it off in the end. Another way that the Allies eventually got the upper hand against the Germans in the Battle of the Atlantic, in addition to sonar, they also were able to break the German codes. The German codes was called the Enigma Code. It used the world's first electronic or electromechanical, to be precise, machine to encode the message, and it was supposedly unbreakable. Well, it was unbreakable unless you have a little help. To break the Enigma Code, British code-breaking teams working under a brilliant mathematician named Alan Turing, who was the intellectual father of the modern computer, built code-breaking machines called bombies. These bombies were essentially extremely primitive early computers, and this laid the foundation for modern computer science, the attempt to break the Enigma Code. The bombies were massive. They were the size of an entire city block. They had programming that was punched into a paper tape. They had a functional memory of about maybe 8 bytes of information, but that's a whole lot more than anybody had built before. And they could crack these codes, especially once some of the key code-breaking things were captured off of German submarines. So by farther into the war, the Allies were breaking the German codes regularly, and that gave the Allies a crucial advantage in winning the Battle of the Atlantic. All right, I'm going to also briefly touch, in addition to submarines, I'm going to talk about other types of weapons that are common in World War II. In addition to submarines, we also, of course, have tanks. The World War II is the tank war. Tanks were invented for World War I, but they were too primitive and nobody knew how to use them properly. World War II is the tank war. You have battles involving hundreds and hundreds of tanks wheeling and maneuvering against each other, particularly in Russia, to a lesser extent in other parts of Europe and North Africa. It is the tank war. The Germans probably had the best tanks in World War II, I gotta be honest with you. The problem was they didn't have the industrial capacity to make enough of them. The Russians had some pretty good tanks too. They weren't quite as good as the German ones, but they made so many of them that the small decrease in quality, being not quite as good, didn't really matter. The American tanks typically were not nearly as good as the German tanks, but the Americans had so many of them. I mean, it probably took 3 Sherman tanks to take out 1 German Panther. But the Americans had 3 Shermans for every German Panzer, so it didn't really matter. World War II is also fought in 3 dimensions. Of course, you have airplanes. Again, you had airplanes in World War I, but they were too primitive to have a big impact. Planes have a tremendous impact in World War II, especially in the Pacific. Main 2 types of planes you have fighters and you have bombers. A third category is carrier-based aircraft, which are like light bombers made for ships. So you have fighters, you have light bombers, and heavy bombers. The Germans had a really good fighter, the Bf-109, but they never had a good heavy bomber. The Japanese had an excellent fighter, the Zero, but they never had a good heavy bomber either. The Americans and British were a little bit late to the game. Their early fighters weren't nearly as good as the German or Japanese ones, but later on they developed fighters that were better than anything the Germans and Japanese had. The Americans also developed heavy bombers that were far outclassed anything the Axis had, that could drop tremendous amounts of bombs. They used these in the final months of the war to just bomb Japan and Germany back to the Stone Age, pretty much. Other types of weapons you have World War II is really the first weapon where you have automatic weapons. Other than heavy machine guns, you have light machine guns and submachine guns. The Americans had the Thompson submachine gun, which was the first handheld submachine gun. The Germans had a good light submachine gun, the MP40. So you have the Americans also had the Browning automatic rifle later on, which was a cross between the submachine gun and a heavy machine gun. Hand grenades, flamethrowers, barbed wire. No poison gas. Poison gas was not used in World War II, thankfully. There was a little bit of use of biological weapons. Japan experimented with biological weapons. They dropped some anthrax bombs and bubonic plague bombs on China, but they were experimental. They didn't have a major impact on the war. And let's see, you have ships. For your ships, you have submarines, you have other smaller ships, you have battleships, which are huge. They have giant guns. Then you have aircraft carriers, which are the floating airports. They can only handle small planes, though, with the notable exception of the Doolittle raid. Let's see. There's probably other weapons, but that's about all the time I have. So next time I'm going to talk about D-Day. See you later.